Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And look, can I just take a moment to join with many reflections about the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis. Now, as somebody who often probably puts themselves in the latter category of people of all faiths and none, and if at best probably somebody who would describe themselves as a lapsed Presbyterian, Pope Francis was somebody who genuinely, I think, gave me inspiration and a thought about how to reflect upon the world and think about other people. And I do think that's relevant to today's debate, because I do think we do find ourselves in an absolutely unique, unprecedented global context. And in preparation for this debate, a debate without motion, one which I didn't know quite what direction it would take, I was reflecting on Francis Fukuyama's infamous quote about the end of history and how wrong we were. Because we now have, in our current context, war in Europe, and not just a peripheral war, a war which has seen hundreds of thousands of casualties and deaths. This is genuine interstate warfare, the likes of which we have not seen in 80 years. We're also seeing the resurrection of trade wars and tariffs, which saw a drop of 5% of the Dow Jones Index on the 3rd of April, with a subsequent 6% drop on 4th, on just one announcement. This is a return to protectionism, the likes of which we have not seen for generations. But moreover, we have seen a return of the strongman authoritarian approach to statecraft. And I think that's one that's increasingly prevalent, but also closer to home, not in far-off lands, within Europe. And I don't want to name names, but I think we know the regimes within the European Union which show those strong authoritarian trends. But I would reflect on this, and I would have one note of caution for today's debate. We are right to, I think, worry about the rise of the right and the things, but let's not treat this in terms of these things as being a sense of other, things happening in different places, because they are happening all around us, and we should have seen the signs, because the reality is the number of democracies since 2009 has fallen from 45 to 29. We've seen a doubling of the number of authoritarian regimes around the world. We've seen an erosion of the rule of law, even in Trump's approach. And I think we need to be cautious in terms of how our description of Trump, but we shouldn't have been surprised. We're talking about a president who, in the last time he was in the White House, blocked the appointment of judges to the Appellate Court of the World Trade Organization, which fundamentally blocked that institution. He didn't believe in the global institutions which enable free trade and global movement of goods. But we've also seen, over the last decade or more, increasing levels of democratic interference. We've seen an increasing number of proxy wars, and I think Audrey Nicholl is absolutely right to highlight the overflights of Russian aircraft, the disruption of undersea cables, because this is all around us, and it has been happening for some time. This did not just start happening in 2022. This has been actually happening for well over a decade. And I do have to disagree with my colleagues on the Conservative benches. And while I agree with many of the points they raised about the way the government uses its time, I would also maybe point that sometimes some of these issues the government tiptoes around. But actually, these issues are so profound that we do have to talk about them. I think they raise profound issues around national security, the relationship between national security and economic security, industrial policy and what we must do. And absolutely those touch on devolved areas. But I think, first of all, I would just like to reflect on a point I raised with the First Minister. I think fundamentally we need to reflect on the failure of globalisation. Now, globalisation, I would argue, has been a force for good. It raised 1 billion people globally out of poverty, but it undoubtedly eroded some of the economic structures within our own society. It increased inequality here. I think it increased and exacerbated poverty, and we failed to address that. And I think fundamentally we need to reflect on that. I think we also need to reflect on cooperation actually requires much deeper interactions than simply membership, and we perhaps took those for granted. But I think on our reflections what this means for us in this country, I think fundamentally the point around the interaction between economic and physical security is profound. We have to look at our industrial base. The UK government was absolutely right to take ownership of the British steel plant, because we have to produce things like steel. But likewise for here, in Scotland, we need to think about security in terms of our energy generation in Scotland. We have to ask questions about the level of comfort we have about relying on other countries for fundamental parts of our supply chain, and whether or not other state actors could interfere with our energy supply. But likewise, I would gently say to the Government, while I am pleased by what both the First Minister and Deputy First Minister have said about our defence sector, I think the Scottish Government has at times been coy about talking about the defence sector. And I think the last few months and years have brought into sharp reflection how important the defence sector is, both for our national security, but also actually for providing skilled jobs. But it is fundamentally important. I would also say to members, and there has been the prospect of independence unfortunately raised yet again. Now, all I would say gently to them, at a time when the features or the issues around the UK-Iceland-Greenland gap are rearing their heads again, the thought that we can just simply swap one union for another, I think, is flawed as a concept. We are bound together in our relationship across these islands. Whether we like it or not, we have a shared responsibility to defend this patch of land that sits between the Atlantic and the North Sea. What the Russians are doing in the North Sea cannot be ignored, and we have to cooperate across these islands to defend this part of the world that we call our own. And just in concluding, Presiding Officer, we must learn the lessons of history. I referred to global institutions earlier in my speech. It is a fact that many of those global institutions arose from the ashes of the Second World War. Indeed, the Bretton Woods conference happened during the Second World War because they recognised that relationship between the economy, politics and security. We cannot allow another global conflict to be the way that we find our path back to sound global institutions and global prosperity. Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr.